With the hopefully imminent release of Tesla's full self-driving version 11, the sort of standard wisdom is it's the one stack to rule them all. But it actually might turn out that Tesla's full self-driving will actually be the many, many stacks to rule them all. Let's take a look. Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. So first of all, credit where credit is due. This actually comes out of a conversation with Scott Walter, who is a frequent guest on this channel. The two of us were just having a discussion on Discord and then also via the phone. So anyway, we were talking about how difficult it is for Tesla's full self-driving to work in all of the different environments just in the United States. So we're not even counting, going to other countries or going to very complicated places. We're just saying within the United States, the variety of types of driving is just immense. And how challenging it is to create a generic, one size fits all stack that will be able to drive everywhere. And the idea that we came up with is basically to overfit the neural network for every different environment that you could encounter, and then load it like you load map data into a vehicle as you're driving from place to place. So yeah, there's a bit of stuff to unpack in what I just said there. So let's begin at the beginning. Let's talk about why environments are different and why you might need different neural networks. So the first most obvious thing is weather, right? If you're driving in sunny Arizona or something, it's going to be very different than driving in Florida, where there are often monsoon type rainstorms and things, lots and lots of rain pretty much every day in Florida, which is then going to be different from a place like Vermont or something where half the year you could easily have quite a bit of snowfall, which not only changes the environment around you, but of course, if snow is actively falling and it's on the road, it changes road conditions a lot. So you've got weather conditions, also fog could happen at certain times and things like that. Now, obviously, things that are very intermittent, like fog and stuff, are things that the car is just going to have to handle sort of generically. But you definitely know that if you're driving the car in Tampa, Florida, you're really not going to get snow. So you really don't need that sort of stuff in the neural network. It doesn't really need to know how to handle snow if you're not in an environment where it's reasonable that you could get snow. And then of course, even in a place like Vermont, you could say, well, in the summertime in July, it's pretty unlikely I'm going to get snow up in Vermont. So you could make adjustments based on predictions and say okay, so what we're going to do is load in the sunny weather package or something like that, or the package that we get sunny weather, but we also expect lots and lots of rainstorms. So again, the difference between the West Coast and the East Coast, where you can get very, very large thunderstorms like we got here last night, versus the West Coast where it's much more unusual to get, a lot of rain. It tends to be much more sunny and consistent weather conditions. And of course, if you think about us human beings, we do a bad job of driving in conditions we're not used to. So again, if you transplant somebody from Arizona, southern Arizona, not the mountains, but a place that it never snows and it never really rains or anything like that, if you transplant them to the northeast of the US or the Pacific Northwest or something like that, they're going to have issues because they don't know how to drive in the snow. And so what you have is you have individual people, you have individual groups of people that understand driving conditions in different conditions from other people. You could also have somebody coming from a dry area that can go to a very, very wet area, and they wouldn't understand how to drive in the rain as well, or somebody that comes from a foggy area that doesn't know how to drive in the fog as well. So there's specialized, pieces of information. Actually, as Scott said, he lives in Michigan half the year and in Florida half the year, and he was when the first snowfall happens in Michigan, he said everybody drives terribly, even in Michigan where it snows a lot, because people, again, they've had, say 6 months off since the last snowstorm, and your sort of training goes out the window and you're more of a sunny, warm weather type of driver rather than a snow driver, and it takes a while to relearn how to drive in the snow. So what's the problem with having the neural network just do all of that stuff? Well, the problem is that the sort of generic behavior like sunny, warm weather, things like that, it's going to be able to handle those in a very, very different way. There's kind of some reprogramming that needs to happen. If it's really, really wet, or especially if it's snowing and very cold, you need to have a lot bigger margins between you and the car in front of you. You don't take turns as quickly because you don't know if the traction's going to be as good. There's a lot of elements of driving that you need to do differently based on those weather conditions. And to have something that's able to do all of the conditions at once may be a big ask. Now, I think that certainly sun and rain would be something that you would probably just have to have in one neural network. There's not a lot of way of getting around that, because at any point during the day in most places in the country, you could be out driving and it could start raining. But it's one of those things, again, where snow, a much more severe condition than rain. With snow, you only have to deal with that during certain parts of the year in certain parts of the world. So you really wouldn't have to have that training involved in the vehicle when you're driving around in the summertime. So you could throw that away and do something that's more fine-tuned to summer driving, but then also something that's more fine-tuned to winter driving. But beyond this, we have cultural differences that are really, really important. And I'm sure if you've ever driven more than a couple of hours away from your hometown, no matter where you live in the world, you will have discovered that people drive quite differently. And again, even though the United States is a country, it's made up of 50 states. So every one of those states is effectively a slightly different country than all the other ones, which means that markings on the road might be different, speed limits might be different, but above all, the way people drive is different, according to where you are. And there's even things like actual road things are different. Like in Texas, and I know in some other states, there's this left turn lane where you can do these U-turns around. That doesn't exist in a state like Georgia. So, so if you have a generic type of neural network that does everything, it might not recognize those the Texas left-hand things that you can go around. I think there's one in Michigan like that too as well. But anyway, so everybody has their own quirks. And then of course, how people drive is very, very different. If you go to Los Angeles, people drive very, very differently than they do in, say, Jacksonville, Florida, which is very different than New York City, which is really different than Boston, Massachusetts, because Boston, Massachusetts is kind of nutty with the roundabouts and everything like that, which again is different from Washington, D.C., which is different from Atlanta, which is different from Athens a little bit. So where I live is different from Atlanta driving. So each of these cities or general geographic locales is going to have its own sort of ethos. It's going to have its own way of doing things, its own road markings, its own condition of the road. Someplace the roads are in much worse shape. Like if you go to the north, there's a lot more potholes there because of the freezing and unfreezing of asphalt, and you pop out chunks of the road, which creates potholes. So there's not as many of those, certainly in Florida, as there are in something like Michigan, because the weather conditions are different. So there's those kinds of conditions, but also just the way people drive. Are people really aggressive? Do they tend to be polite? Do they drive above the speed limit? Do they drive at the speed limit? All of those kinds of things are different. And, I'm talking about just the United States, but obviously this is, multiplied even more if you consider the entire world. So if you go to the country of Germany, that's going to be different than France, which is going to be really different than Thailand, which is going to be different than Nepal, which, so you just, et cetera, et cetera. You just think about every single place that you could go. But it's not just countries, like I said. It can actually be individual areas that will have very, very different driving ethos, the way that people drive, the conditions they drive in. So what do you do about that? Well, that brings me to the second part of what I said at the beginning, which is the fine tuning for different environments. So let's just take Atlanta because I live close to there. So let's say we have kind of a general around Atlanta version of our full self-driving. So anywhere within an hour and a half or something. So I guess I would count as part of Atlanta in that case. So anyway, anywhere within an hour and a half of Atlanta, you have this preloaded set where what you do is you take data, not from the entire fleet, but only the Teslas that are driving in this area, and you overfit your neural network to those drivers. And what overfitting means is, you remember that, again, the neural networks are all these little knobs or these little weights that you're multiplying your input by to get an output at a very abstract level. But anyway, what you can do is take the basic generic version of this that works pretty well overall, and you can fine tune it for the specific driving conditions of the Atlanta metro area. And by doing that, you make the car drive better. And effectively what you do is you move the car from being a stranger, right? So let's say we have somebody from Wyoming that moves to Atlanta. There's going to be a period of adjustment for that driver where they're going to be a lot more traffic. People drive differently. The road rules are slightly different. The markings on the things are a little bit different than they are elsewhere. So if you imagine a person who's coming in from out of town and just moved there, it could take them a month or 2 months to become really, really well adjusted to that environment. And then of course you could deal with the weather things as well, snow and in particular, if you have somebody who lived all their life in Florida and then they moved to Vermont, they're going to have to, it's going to take some time for them to learn how to drive in the snow because they're not experienced with it. I grew up driving in the snow, but I haven't driven in snow, at least a lot of snow, in years and years and years. So my snow driving capability would be pretty atrocious. So if I moved back up to the north and had to drive in snow again, I would have to relearn. So there's this learning process, and what you don't want is you don't want the vehicle, the FSD vehicle, to behave like the newbie. And currently that's pretty much what happens. When you go anywhere, so I'm driving out of my neighborhood and the car behaves like it's never been to this locale before. It's like, oh wow, I do pretty well, right? I'm a good driver, but I'm not a refined driver for this particular environment. And what you could do by overfitting, by tuning all of these weights very specifically to Atlanta or to Burlington, Vermont, or to New York City or Los Angeles or Portland or whatever, just pick your city. It doesn't really matter. By fine tuning it to that, you could have the car drive as if it's an experienced driver in that area rather than a newbie. And that is a huge advantage. And again, also with the weather as well. So rather than being a newbie snow driver and making really serious mistakes, you drive as if you're an experienced snow driver. And you're like, okay, so this is like somebody who grew up driving in the snow and they're used to it. And so they're much, much better than somebody who's just coming from a sunny, warm locale and doesn't know yet how to drive in the snow. And this overfitting, I think, would go a long way towards making people feel more comfortable with the vehicles. So one of the things that I feel when I'm being driven around by Full Self-Driving, when I'm monitoring the driving, is that the car is a very good generic driver, but it doesn't get all the nuances of where I live. So when I go out of town, and I'm someplace that I'm not familiar with, the Full Self-Driving does great because it drives as well as I do, considering that neither of us knows what the hell's going on. But when I get to a place that I do and I'm familiar with, right? So the Atlanta area for me. So when I'm around this area, I'm like, I know how people drive around here, and the car doesn't seem to understand that as well as I do, which becomes frustrating for me. So the car could become, instead of a newbie, it could become an experienced driver. And then of course you could have kind of a default like interstate package as well. So the one thing about interstates in the United States is that they do tend to be relatively similar because there's federal laws that control all of that. So once you got on an interstate like 75 or 85 or 40 or whatever it is, once you got on an interstate, it would then be able to use a fine-tuned package that was just for the interstate so that it could operate more effectively in that environment as well. So you're saying, all right, John, great idea, but how the hell do you actually implement this? And that's where we get to the downloadable aspect of being able to do this. So, again, consider like Google Maps or whatever, Apple Maps or anything like that. If you're driving around, if you go to a new place and you load up the maps, you'll see it kind of goes to like blip, 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 and it fills in the information about where you are so that it can then tell you where you are, right? So you can see the map. So it's downloading data off the internet that's allowing you to be able to see your environs and, to search for restaurants or whatever the heck you want to do with your map data. So likewise, if you took one neural network architecture, so let's say that Tesla finalizes their neural network architecture, or at least pretty well finalizes it, and they're like, this is what it's going to look like. These are the umpteen different neural nets that we're going to use, and this is how the vision is going to be processed, and this is how this is going to be output, all of that. So once the architecture itself is defined, like the shape of the thing, all of those weights could be replaced by other weights. Now, that's a much bigger download than a map download, so you're not going to be wanting to do this all the time. But if you consider like, most of my days, right, are spent around my home area, so that I would download whatever map it was, like the Atlanta metro area, and that would serve me most of the time. But then if I went to see my parents, it could then download as I left, and maybe it can use the navigation thing. It knows that I'm driving. It's like, oh, this guy's going on a 9 or 10 hour drive. So we'll be able to load in the highway stack, and it could just go like, okay, generic highway stack, load that in. So that's some data that you have to download, but it's only weights. You're not changing the architecture or anything. You're just adjusting the weights. So it could download that, and it could sort of pre-do that. Maybe when you got to your first supercharger stop, it could either maybe use Wi-Fi. This is something that the Wiz, actually, Mars Embassy, actually suggested this idea, and I thought it was pretty brilliant. And that is that Tesla's planning on having Wi-Fi at most of their superchargers. And so what you could do is, if you were on a 10-hour road trip and you were going to be on the highway a lot, when you got to the supercharger, it could then access the Wi-Fi and download these new weights as you're charging, reset the full self-driving computer, and then as you got on for your next leg, you would have something that was optimized for driving on the highway. And then when we get to my parents' house, which is near Washington, D.C., which has, again, its own driving ethos around there, you would get there and either at a supercharger outside of town, or maybe when it's just at my parents' house and it's sitting there and it can connect to Wi-Fi, it would then download the Washington, D.C. package, and that would change the weights just a little bit again, but it would allow it to understand what it's doing better and understand how drivers are going to work and, possibly weather conditions and other things like that. But by fine-tuning to each of these areas, suddenly the car could go from being just sort of like generally good, but not really good anywhere, to being overfit. So it's like really good. It's as good as it can get for a specific area. And by the way, this is a trick that people who do neural network training use all the time, especially when you're training something new and you just want to see if it works. You like overfit. You use a small subset of data that's very, very contained. And so you're like, yeah, this is what I'm looking for. I'm not looking for the general solution right now. I'm looking for the very, very specific one just to prove that this is working. And so you can utilize that system to overfit to a specific answer that you're looking for to prove that that architecture is working. You can also do it at the end after you train something like GPT-3 or something, which is very, very general. You could then retrain it based on an individual language or some subset of things, or maybe doctor's words or things like that. So you can overfit a general model for a very, very specific purpose, which is what I'm suggesting here. That what you get instead of one stack to rule them all is you get 100 stacks to rule them all. You have all of these geographical areas, and as you get into those areas, you download those new stacks. And there would be one sort of generic overall thing that would sort of take over. Maybe that would be the highway stack. There's just sort of this generic stack that's like, it works well everywhere. But once you get to a specific place, you load in the new data, and as the car is sitting, it flips that, and it changes from the generic stack, which works just okay everywhere, to one that's really, really well situated for that particular environment, that particular weather condition, those particular kinds of drivers, all of that kind of stuff. And suddenly the car goes from being sort of, generally good to being really good at that area. And then when you move to the next place, if you're doing a road trip, it becomes really good at that particular area. And honestly, I think in the end, we may still be a ways away from this because you have to get the architecture right first, and you have to get the generic aspect of it right first. But at some point, I truly believe that that's what Tesla's going to have to do. If we take this to like the more extreme case of country by country, certainly they're going to have to overfit to Canada because they have, kilometers per hour as opposed to miles per hour. So that's a pretty major change. But then when you go to Germany or France or England, which is the left side of the road, or Australia or wherever, So as you move to these different places, different countries, you're obviously going to have to retrain the network for all of these different countries. But why not do it on smaller geographic bases rather than like country by country or something? Do it by, geographic areas that are clearly defined and different from each other. Now, how you define that, I don't know exactly. But that's an interesting thing that Tesla has to figure out themselves. But certainly you would know that driving in Los Angeles is going to feel very different than driving in like Chandler, Arizona, which is going to feel different than driving in Dallas, Texas. Go across the country. And all of these major areas are going to be different from each other. And I'm pretty firmly convinced that in time, in order for this to be as good as it can possibly be in each area, you're going to have to retrain it for each area. Now, that means that maintenance and upkeep of these neural networks is going to be a pain in the butt, because you're going to have the generic thing. And every time you update the generic model and it gets a little bit better, or you change something out, you'll have to retrain on all of this overfit type data. But that's where something like Dojo comes in, because if you can retrain this stuff really, really quickly, then what you can do is even the overfit training that you're working on, the sort of secondary training thing. So again, you take your fleet, right? So you've got all 50 United States, and you've got the fleet and the way everybody drives, and you're learning from all of that stuff. But then what you do is you just tag it. You're just by geographic location. You're like, people within this area are now the data set that I'm interested in, rather than everybody in the entire country. And then you fine tune these weights, and that shouldn't take nearly as much time. Number one, the data set's going to be smaller. Number two, your weights are going to be very, very close to correct already. So you don't need that much training to like fine tune it. You should see the loss function, bottom out very, very quickly. But those little adjustments are going to make the difference between the car being like generally good and being really good at specific things. things. So anyway, I know this may not be what most people are thinking about right now with the version 11, one stack to rule them all, but the more I think about this, at least from the outside, and again, I don't have any inside information at Tesla, but from the outside, it seems like to get the best possible performance, they're going to eventually need to overfit to weather conditions and to geographic areas, and certainly at the very least, they're going to have to overfit per country. You're not going to want to have the exact same stack working in the United States with miles per hour as Canada, which works in kilometers per hour. So rather than a single stack to rule them all, we could have 11D1 stacks to rule them all. And there's a little Hobbit reference right there. Actually, I think that's Lord of the Rings, not the Hobbit anyway, but 11D1st birthday. So there you go. Anyway, so we could have to have a lot of these stacks, and they could be loaded into your car, and it could swap out as you are stopped or something like that, so that you would be able to drive more like a professional driver who's very, very used to this particular area rather than a newbie in the area. All right, I hope you enjoyed this episode and found it fun and interesting and thought-provoking. If you did, please do like it so other people can find it. And also, of course, consider subscribing for more of this kind of content. And of course, I would be very curious to find out your thoughts about this, and let me know in the comments what you think. Maybe you think I'm a complete loon and this is not the way to go, and it should just be one generic stack. But if you do think that, and that's fine, at least consider the fact that if you've ever moved to a new place and had to learn to drive there, consider the mental gymnastics that you had to go through in order to learn to drive in that new place. And you know, at least take that into consideration as you're thinking about feedback for this episode. As always, a huge shout out to my patrons on Patreon, particularly Mars Embassy and Scott Walter. You guys were actually both instrumental in helping me think through all of this stuff and crystallize the ideas a little bit more than I would have otherwise. Anyway, I very much appreciate you and all of my Patreon patrons so much. And of course, if you want to join the team, just check out the link in the description. And if you're interested in a whole bunch of really cool merch, check out our merch store. Link is in the description. We have TeslaBot t-shirts, the Tesla meme t-shirt, success is a possible outcome, 4680 battery cells. All of that stuff is on t-shirts, mugs, tumblers, and on. So check it out. And for those of you interested in investing, check out WeBull, an amazing platform for buying and selling stocks, and now cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, Dogecoin, and others. Open an account and get a free stock valued at up to $200, and fund your account and get another free stock valued at up to $1,600. Check out the link in the description and help the channel at the same time. Thank you. And finally, don't forget we are both Tesla and Amazon affiliates. If you look in the description, you can see how going shopping for a solar roof, a Powerwall, or anything on Amazon, hint, hint, with holiday shopping going on, that all helps out the channel very much. In the meantime, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.